Hey, hello, and welcome to Easily Accessed Online Tools for STEAM Educators. My name is Cindy McKinney, and I'm with Region 8, and I am joined today by Laura Smith. Laura is a recently retired, freshly retired middle school science educator who joined our Makerspace training team this last year. And she's going to spend some time with you today going over some online resources that you can use as you kind of rebuild and redesign your STEM education into a distance learning STEM education approach. So I want to welcome Laura and let you know that all of the links that you will be seeing in the slide presentation will be available on a document that we will make available to you in a link below the video recording. So I'm going to just turn it over to Laura and enjoy the time that you have with her.
Hi, Cindy. It's nice to be here with Region 8 and you and Dr. Josh Wenning, and also the rest of my team. We have Jane Gorman, Chris Riley, and Mike Gorman. As a group, we've been working to try to change how we are doing professional development. Everyone is going through changes right now. Teachers especially have had to really rethink how they're presenting information. For some teachers, they've been doing e-learning for a number of years and have gotten quite adept at it, but never have they had to do it for weeks and weeks at a time. For others, it's the first time they've ever had to look at an e-learning approach to their instruction. This is the first time I've ever done a webinar. It's the first time I've never been able to be in person with people as we're doing some professional development. So we're all doing new things, and we need to keep that in mind, that it's new for us and it doesn't always go smoothly. What I'm hoping to do today is to help you find some easily accessed tools to help instruct your students. And these tools are going to be things that can be used from pre-K through 12, cross-curricular, and they're tools that I've used and have some experience with. That they're free. Many of them are professionally created, they're vetted sources, and a lot of them come with lesson plans already established. They're simple, and I think that's a good place to start. Simple things, simple for you to use and access, and simple for your students to use as well. For some teachers, you're going to see tools that you have seen before. They may not be new to you, but hopefully maybe it will refresh your memory, or it will we'll look at them in a new way so that you have new ideas of how you might use these and start incorporating them in your lesson plans. We're going to look at 4 different categories: virtual field trips and interviews, simulations and interactives, online assessments, and also video clips. One thing I want to point out is that almost all of these are already standards based, and all the rest of them are easily translated into standards, so they are doing what you need them to do, that you're helping advance your education for your students. Our first group, the virtual field trips and interviews, we're going to start out by looking at some virtual museum tours, some virtual field trips, then we'll move into Google Earth tours, and also how to interview professionals. So we'll start off with virtual museum tours. I've seen a lot of sites come up, and actually that's what made me think of this entire project, is that when the COVID first came up and impacted our schools, my Twitter and Facebook feed just blew up with all kinds of ideas of do this and do that, and I was overwhelmed just looking at it, and I'm not in a classroom. So I started to think of what are some tools that are easily accessible that teachers can use that they can jump right into without being overwhelmed. And there were a lot of really good museums that are offering tours. A lot of them come with lesson plans and ideas. For instance, you can see there's crafts that they're showing you that would relate and translate into these museums. Everything from the Vatican to the Field Museum. A Field Museum, actually, if you contact them, will give you a special tour with specimens that you request, and they'll show you those. There's the Cowboy Museum out west. There's a wide variety of museums, and this is really cross-curricular. You can help your students explore things. If you're an art teacher, there are obvious relationships there, but also even if you are a language arts teacher, and you can find ways to incorporate things like vocabulary words, and expose yourselves to your students to places that they may be learning of in social studies or through books in language arts. And so this was one site that had 12 really good world-class museums. You can find lots of other sites as well. And a lot of these tours are available now and will continue to be available. Some of the things that we're going to show are available right now during COVID, and it will be interesting to see what they continue to allow to be available throughout our pandemic period. The next site that we're going to look at will be virtual field trips. This happens to be through Discovery, and virtual field trips are always a great way to engage students. And you need to think a little bit differently than just a field trip that you might take as a science class. You could think also for people like in music or in gym, that you could take students to a venue. You could take them to an actual Red Sox stadium and talk about the game of baseball. You could take these kind of virtual field trips and relate them to all kinds of different subjects. And again, you can help students explore the world that they wouldn't normally be able to explore. These field trips, I've seen everything from planetariums to farms to, let me see, you could go to Mars. Lots of things that you would relate to almost any curriculum. One of the things that I also saw that I thought was very interesting is that there are field trips of places of work. So we always want to talk to our students about career opportunities as we look at those career pathways, and a virtual field trip might be a way that you could help your students get that type of side point to the presentations that you're giving, is that talk about the careers involved not only with the field trips, but you can also take field trips of places of work. Next up, we have Google Earth Tours. Google Earth Tours came out long ago, and when Google Earth was first introduced to the educational world, a lot of people jumped on that bandwagon, and I think some people like me had forgotten about it for a while, and I brought it back up to my attention, this idea that you can visit places through Google Earth. Each time you look at one of these little spots, you can find out and click for information. This is really very cross-curricular. You can take a tour of the Roman Empire and how it developed. You can take a tour, as the example is here, of a book where it walks you through the book and talking about the different locales mentioned in the book. You could relate this to science. You could relate it to all types of things. And again, it's very well vetted, and there's a lot of existing tours. But other ways you might think of using it is that you as a teacher could create a tour, or you as a class could create a tour, or individual students could create a tour, where each student is responsible for different aspects of a particular locale. And this is a good way to do some group type of work, even though you're all working remotely. And again, there are a lot of already existing tours that make this really easy and a fun activity. Next up is interviewing a professional. This is probably one of the most engaging things I ever did with my students. The site that we're looking at is Skype Scientist, where you can literally get on this site and they will connect you to a scientist of your choice, and they will have a Skype session with you and your students. I started interviewing professionals before there was such a thing as Skype a Scientist, and one of the things to remember is that the business community wants to be involved. They want to be helpful, and it's actually one of the initiatives that Region 8 is working with, is to connect businesses with educators. And so this is where I just leveraged people I knew when I started this. 10, 15 years ago, my nephew he was working as a chemist. He had a PhD in chemistry. And so I reached out to him, and he Skyped us from his laboratory. And the students and I had a conversation with him, and we learned more about his profession and what it took to become a chemist. When we were talking in our environmental section, I reached out to my brother, who's an environmental engineer, and he talked to my students about that profession. We need to remember that we always need to be bringing in these professional aspects, these career aspects to our classrooms. But interviewing a professional is a really nice way to do this. You can do it in a variety of ways, where you have students research different topics and develop their questions, and then you can send that off to a scientist. I did that with a former student who was a geneticist. My students came up, they had just finished talking about Jurassic Park. They were very excited about the new Jurassic Park, and they wanted to know how real that was. So I was able to send off questions to this geneticist, and he responded to my students. It's one of the things that you can do in real time, obviously, but you could also record it and have it posted so that you and your students could access it later. Important thing to remember is that you're doing this not just as a fun activity, but it's a learning activity, and so there needs to be a goal and a purpose. And you want to make sure that your students are going to get something out of this. Sometimes I would use this as a great post-test activity. Students would finish their test, and then they would listen to one of the recordings or watch one of the recordings of one of the people that we had interviewed, and they'd get some background information. It's also something you could think about how you could have students interview their parents or somebody else remotely even, and talk about careers that may relate exactly to your content or may just be of interest to your students. And this is something that any age could do, interviewing someone and finding out what they do for a living and why they're interested in it, why is it it's an exciting profession for them. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is how do we integrate these into the lesson? So these are some good topics, some good activities, but they shouldn't just be add-ons. We're not just doing things to do them. Just like in your classroom, you want everything to have meaning. It's not busy work. So when you're talking about these types of tools, you want to think about the big picture. Work backwards in your lesson plan. What is your goal? And make sure that your students are doing something to show you that they're actively engaged. They may be asking questions. They may be responding to questions that you've posted. You may be offering them some type of discussion format, some kind of platform. You may have them write reports, but it has to be something that you're using that helps them extend their knowledge and further their growth. This is a really important aspect with any of these types of tools. It shouldn't be just an add-on. One of the things that you can do with these is that you can, as a teacher, use some of the different tools to share your screen with students and use it in real time. You can record it so students can access it later, or you can have a platform where you're discussing it and looking at it with a split screen. Those are different options that you can think of when you're looking at these tools. The next thing that we're going to look at are simulations and interactives. This, I want to give you a really good caveat here. You know, when you make pancakes, you do a little test pancake to make sure the griddle's hot enough and that the pancake's going to cook up nice and fluffy. You do not want to start one of these activities without having a test pancake done. I used to work with several of my students who were tech savvy, and I would send them to a site and say, here's what I want students to do. Can you access this site? Does it work on every browser? Do you need to download Flash? What types of things do you need in order to make this site work? And that's an important thing to remember, especially with these simulations and interactives, is that you need to pre-test them to make sure that they're going to work for your students. And those are things that, even though it works on your device, it may not work on theirs. And you need to have a good understanding of what type of devices your students are actually working on in order for them to happen. So we're going to look at a wide variety of simulations and interactives. And some of them are very science focused because that's what I taught. But we're going to look at how we might use them in other classes as well. So the first one is PHET, or PHET. And this is really a very science and math focused type of interactive, where there's a lot of different simulations here. They're very much vetted. They come with lesson information. They're really well done. And it's one of those things where a student can become very engaged, maybe on a topic that they weren't engaged in before. Sometimes we find with math that that's difficult for students to be engaged in when they are used to listening to a teacher explain something. This helps them see it from a different perspective. PHET has a lot of really good resources, but my language arts teacher also used PHET. We would do a lot of cross-curricular activities, and one of them would be like bioethics. And so when I would be talking about DNA structure, she would have the students do a simulation on DNA in her room so they would see the importance of cross-curricular. They could use those same vocabularies. They could see those connections that were being made. Another thing to think about is that you can use some of those things like PHET offline. Another good one here is GIZMOS. GIZMOS is a subscription-based simulation. However, they have a lot of free ones. And also, my colleagues and I found that you could use the 30-day subscription. We had some that we really liked for our natural selection and DNA section of our content. And so we just joined for free for 30 days. And every year we joined for free for 30 days. And that worked out just fine. They have a wide variety of activities already pre-made. One thing I really liked about GIZMOS is that it comes with great vocabulary. Many of us have moved away from textbooks, and right now textbooks might not be available to students. And when you ask a student to get vocabulary offline, we all know what happens, right? They're going to end up with the first thing that Google gives them. This is excellent vocabulary, and then you can use it in your content, and we really found that as a great resource, as we didn't have textbooks to rely on anymore for that type of thing. A lot of their worksheets that they have are editable. You can make them so that you can submit them online very easily. And this seemed to be a really good site. Like FET, they had some really good focused standards and goals of what you should try to do in your classroom when you're using a tool like this. The next up is site-specific. You might find with your specific grade level and your specific content that there are interactives and simulations out there. We did dissections, and the online dissections were free and very easily accessible, and we used them often in our classroom, sometimes as a way to introduce the topic. Dissection for most students was something they were afraid of, and they were unsure, and so the more information I could give them, the more comfortable they were with the content. And so we could do an online dissection, and I could point out specific things. It was also a good wrap-up. You should have seen this item and this item, but you might not have gotten there, so let's take a look at what it should have looked like so that you can understand how this organism works. So these online dissections became a really great tool for us to use in the classroom, and you should be able to find, with pretty easy searching, some online simulations and interactives that are more content specific. NOAA is another great resource that we often overlook. The NOAA resource they have lots of simulations. The example I have here, when we were in chemistry, there's a nice little interactive on how the atoms in metals are connected, what those bonds look like, and why metals are so strong and yet can still bend. And so these are interactives that I could have set it to the students, and they might or might not have understood it, and they can watch it and manipulate in an interactive that really helped them to understand it much better. And one of the things that I loved about NOAA is that there's reading that they could do. There were also little video clips. So the whole lesson plan is very well thought out, and you could see how the interactives would work within your lesson. You could take just the interactive, or you could follow the lesson plans that NOAA has as well. There's a wide variety, and I've used them. One of the ones the students liked the most for me was Galapagos Islands, when we were talking about Charles Darwin, and they got to use some interactives to see what Charles Darwin would have seen on this on his journey. Another good site is NOAA. It became really important in the last couple of years for me as a science teacher to make sure that I was using government-approved sites that the government actually funds, as I talked about things like climate change. And NOAA is a wonderful site where we're getting great content, and it's real-life data. And when you open up the educational resources, you can see that there's a wide variety of things. It's not just weather, it's not just about the oceans, but it involves chemistry, it involves all kinds of biology, and it's easy enough to use for elementary students all the way up to high school students. Here's an example of one of their interactives where you are looking at real-time data and you put in different layers that you want to see. What's the air pollution like? What's the water pollution like? What's the current wind pattern? So you can connect wind to air pollution. I could see a great connection right now with COVID, where you're looking at real-time data of what is happening pollution-wise as China starts their economy back up. What is happening to areas that, like India, where for the first time people there can see the Himalaya mountains. And so you can use this as a connection, even if you're not science-focused, you are current events and real-world focused, and you could use a site like this. Another great tool that the government helps fund is NASA. And I had the opportunity to work with the educators down at NASA. They have a really robust educational program, and they're in Houston. And I know very few people who aren't interested in space in one sort or another. So there's lots of ways you could tie this type of thing in. There are interactives for small children when they look at the International Space Station, much more sophisticated ones that might be used with middle school and high school students. And it's a great connection, and you get a lot of students very actively engaged when you talk about a site like NASA. Another thing to think about is, again, to bring in the career aspect. For all of these sites, one of the things that I would really enjoy doing is I bring in careers at every opportunity, and not just science careers. So when we were looking at a simulation and I'd have students actively engaged, I always had students who told me, I'm going to be a video game designer. And so I would tell them, you can do the same sort of things by being a simulation designer. You can design these kind of simulations. Somebody had to write the code to make these simulations happen, but they had to know enough science content in order for that to be the case. So it's important that we integrate that idea of careers through this as well, and maybe think of them in different ways. You're not just looking at being an astronaut. What are the things that go beyond creating that NASA website? Those are tools that students need to know how to use, and we're really trying to work on those 21st century skills as we work on the idea of portrait of a graduate, and to continue to bring in this idea of careers as an important aspect. And for art, the same thing. You know, what does that look like? What does that simulation look like? What are the colors? There's music involved? So you can bring in a lot of different aspects and a lot of different subjects and careers for those types of tools. The next tool we're going to talk about are online assessments. So a lot of you will be using some type of platform. We were using Canvas, and it came with an assessment tool. And I found that to be a really helpful tool when I was looking at summative assessments. Does my student know this information? But formative assessments, especially when we're not there to individually see how students are doing, can really serve an important role as we're learning this new information. So online assessments like Quizlet, quizzes, and Kahoots, to me, really fill that gap. They're a little more fun, a little more light, and very easy to create. We'll start with Quizlet. This is the first one and the one that I use the most, first one that I used. You can easily get onto Quizlet, and you can see there's a wide variety of quizzes already made, already created by teachers. Sometimes when we found that things weren't working quite well and we needed something quick to do to add to help a student understand something, we would look for one of those assessments and do a little tweaking with some of the information and put a Quizlet out that would help students grasp that concept. They simply have to put in this code in order to use it. Here's an example of a real life Quizlet that was created on real numbers. You can see you can integrate all kinds of images as well. It's a very straightforward tool to use. I was able to easily cut and paste things from like my vocabulary list or my PowerPoint into a Quizlet, and very quickly created it. I had students all the time that said, Mrs. Smith, can I create the vocab Quizlet for this unit? And they would create the Quizlet, I'd check it over, and then I could send it to other students to access as well. We also did that as a team. All the science teachers would get together and someone would create a Quizlet for a specific assessment and then share it amongst all of us. Quizzes is another tool. I did not use this as much as I used Quizlet. It has more bells and whistles. It's like quizzes on steroids. You can see that you can do, you can play the quiz. There's flashcards. There's challenging to friends. Again, there's a whole vocabulary, a whole library of tools there already created, quizzes already created for you to use. I had a lot of students who liked this because it seemed flashier, but that's something you have to think about. For some students, that's what would be distracting to them. Something more straightforward might be more helpful. But quizzes is one that a lot of my colleagues have really enjoyed using. Another assessment tool is Kahoot, and this is one that is simple enough to use that we used it at a family reunion where everyone put in different pieces of information, and we had a lot of fun with it. Kahoot is easy to use. My students love using this in the classroom. I'm not sure why, but for some reason, the fact that it's a competition, there's a time limit and that there's music that went along with it, that really engaged my students, and they would be very excited about playing Kahoot. Very easy to use. You can quickly get into a Kahoot game. You can give the pin to the students and they can access it as well. One of the things that Kahoot had that I really liked is that they could visually see the answers then afterwards. And oftentimes there would be more than one correct answer. And that's something that sometimes is hard for students to recognize, that there's more than one right answer. And so for them to visually be able to see that not only is A right, but so is B and C, I just thought that was a good way for them to get a broader understanding of what it was that we were looking at, what it is that we were listening to. So how can you use these effectively in an e-learning situation? One of the things that I really like about these online assessments is that you can use some that are already created. You as the teacher can create them to really focus on the content that you're after, or you can have students create them. My students really enjoyed being a part of that creation. So they would have to pull out what's the most important thing about this specific topic. How would you write a question about it that makes sense to your peers? What if you were trying to explain this to a third grader? How could you easily make them understand this? And so as a class, as a group, we could combine and make our Kahoot or make our quizzes. And that helped them with their understanding, because as we know, if you can teach it, then you must understand it. So that was a great tool that I used. I could see often which students were struggling. A lot of times they'll give you that kind of analysis, that kind of feedback. As a class, were we understanding this information? Were we not understanding this information? Oftentimes we would play it in the class and then I would post it and they would go have a chance to review it. And my students would often say, I played that Kahoot 10 times and I really feel like I understand this information. Another thing that I like about these online tools is that for my students, when they would go and get vocabulary, if my test question didn't have that vocabulary definition exactly like theirs, then they wouldn't understand it. And so this gives you an opportunity to present that same vocabulary, but maybe the definition is changed a little bit. It means the same thing, but the wording is different. And that was a good way for my students to get used to that type of understanding. It's not surface understanding, having a deeper understanding of those concepts. For e-learning, you could set a time where you're all playing at the same time. You can post them so students can play them whenever they want. They can play as a class, they could play as a whole group. And they can, again, I think one of the important aspects is that you can use it as a review before you would take a summative assessment. So I found these online assessments to be very quick, very easy, and very helpful for my students. The last topic we're going to talk about are video clips, YouTube channels, PBS Learning Media, Discovery Education, and some subject-specific ideas for video clips. For the YouTube channels, this is something that I was kind of late to the game of understanding that there were great channels specifically for my content. My language arts teacher, Melissa Renfro, clued me in with Grammar Girl. Her class used Grammar Girl extensively to work through vocabulary, and the kids really looked forward to that. And so it was constant content that she could put out there and say, this is the piece that we're working on right now. There are all kinds of any subject matter related channels that you can help the students find something that will be helpful for them and for the content that you're working on. Khan Academy is a really well-known and well-done channel, and it actually started because a little girl contacted her older cousin and said, I don't understand how you change measurements, that conversion thing. And so he didn't know how long distance, how he could help her. And so he figured out a way to record it and post it on YouTube. And it was so helpful that her grades it really improved. Having someone like that talk her through the process, that it became a phenomenon. It's a huge resource now. And that's something that you can always point your students to, is going to something like Khan Academy if they're struggling with a topic. PBS Learning Media is another great resource for getting video clips. And what I like about this resource is that it has very short clips, 3-4 minutes to entire videos. We watched often The Code of Life when we were talking about DNA, and it gave our students a really good glimpse into what they needed. We would discuss the topic, show the clip, ask them to look for specific items within the clip, and then review that afterwards, and showing it just a piece at a time and really pulling out that content for them. As you can see, there's a wide variety of existing material out there. It's very easily organized. There are some people who find it's very traditional and they don't like that as much. For other people, that is very helpful. And I think in these times, especially when there's so much chaos and confusion, sometimes the basic thing is really what's going to be the best. Obviously, standards-based, a lot of supporting material to help you out, all kinds of content, and as you can see, all different grade levels. Discovery Ed is one of those that is actually subscription-based. However, from what we found, a lot of schools actually have subscription to Discovery Ed. Again, very easy to find information that is content-focused. It's very standards-based. You can have lots of age and curricular options, and it's another good source for looking at providing clips for your students to view. You might want to think about talking to your tech advisors to see what subscriptions does your school have, what access to tools do you have that maybe you aren't familiar with or you haven't thought about for a while, and it's a good time to look at those. And also we're finding during this period that a lot of the subscriptions are being waived, and so you have the opportunity to try some things that you wouldn't normally be able to try. But do keep in mind that there's no guarantee that they'll always be free, but you can start accessing some things and getting acquainted with them. Probably for most of us, we looked for site-specific, subject-specific clips. Something that relates exactly to the content that you're looking for, a way to introduce a topic, a way to reinforce a topic, a way to review a topic. One of the ones that I found really helpful for my student was this nice little clip about how evolution in Yellowstone National Park is happening. It really helped them with some of their misunderstandings, where they thought of evolution happening over a course of many hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years, when in fact at Yellowstone it happened in a matter of 7 years when they reintroduced wolves. And the video clips are very engaging to students. And so it's a great way to help get them focused and concentrated on a subject. This one happens to start off with wolves howling, so right away I had my kids' attention. And I also found, for some curious reason, that my kids were more attuned when a British correspondent of any kind would talk. They loved the British accent, and they would listen so intently so they could listen to them say things like aluminium instead of aluminum. So it's interesting what will pique your students' attention and how that might look. One thing to think about when you're going out and looking at these clips, though, if you're not going through one of those previous sites, is that you want to make sure that you've vetted them and you've watched them all the way through. That can be painful, but it's an important lesson that some of my colleagues have learned the hard way. You don't know what's on a video unless you've watched it all the way through, and you don't want to put anything out there that perhaps isn't exactly what you thought it was. So how do you integrate these ideas of clips into your classroom? Again, a lot of times it's a nice little teaser, a little hook to get kids interested in the subject. Also working as content or as a wrap-up. Again, a great way to bring in career possibilities tied directly to your content, or perhaps not tied to your content, but always to be thinking about how they can see how this could impact them in the future. You can share videos, and there's a great webinar right now that Region 8 has by Andy Dietrich on screencasting and how you can do that. So that's something to look at, real easy techniques. And so you could use that in a variety of ways. And again, you can post those things on your platforms for students to get to at their convenience. You could use them with things like a Google Suite or with Zoom. One thing that I've found is that a lot of teachers are creating their own videos, doing the flipped classroom, and they're finding that their students aren't really watching the whole video. And one teacher said that she plants little eggs within her video. so that a student finds the egg and they get some type of reward. So that means they've actually listened to and watched the video in order to find those little hints that she's dropped in her video. All right, so we've talked about a lot of tools. Some of them may be very familiar to you. Some of them may not be really that familiar at all, but they're good tools that can help you really move into this idea of e-learning in a much easier fashion to take some of the stress off of you and of your students. These tools are engaging. Kids like to do this type of thing, and so it's important to keep that in mind. But it's also important that we think about, again, the big picture. This shouldn't be an add-on. This shouldn't be a thing that they click on and forget. You need to actively integrate this into your content, into your lesson plan, so that they are engaged and they are moving forward in their education. Working back through that, they should be writing questions. They should be responding to questions. They should be having discussions on what they're doing. They should be able to really show that they've been learning. And you want to make sure that it works well for them. So make sure that you're testing these things with another student before you put them out there. But one of the most interesting things that I thought about is that this really provides a lot of choice for students. Sometimes you think about doing things in only a certain way, and you get used to presenting information in a certain way, and this provides some choice for you and for the student. One of the most interesting things that I saw come across my Twitter feed was the statement that one of the teachers wrote. They said, "Today my students listed about 20 things they actually like about remote learning. And we quickly turned the list into changes I need to make to my classroom next year." I think that's really an important thing for all of us to think about. What are we doing now that works so well that we should try to do that in our classroom next year, whether we're in the classroom itself or whether we are continuing with e-learning? And so I hope that this has introduced you or reintroduced you to some of those quick and easy and free tools that are out there that you can integrate into your classroom.
Laura, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge in this subject area. As I was looking at all of the resources, since you're coming from a middle school background, a lot of them looked like they were middle school, secondary. Do they reach down into the lower levels? Are some of them better at that than others, or will you find something at all for K through 12 on all of these resources?
Almost all of them will have something for K through 12. Some of those, like we showed, were pretty specific to science and math, but oftentimes if you start on those resources, it will jump you to additional resources. Mm-hmm. Some are definitely much better for geared towards elementary, like the NOAA, anything that like PBS is putting out. It's going to really make sure that it's hitting all grade levels. Yeah. But for the most part, like those assessments, those were easily done. The videos, you can find things that are really subject content and grade-wise focused for whatever you need.
Well, and I noticed that you have your contact information on the slide. So I guess my other question for you would be, if I'm a teacher out there and I have a content area I need to cover next week and I want some quick resource and I don't have time to go through all of the resources, could I email you and ask you for some tips or some ideas on directions I would want to go in if I know specifically what I want to cover, but I don't have time to look through everything? Would you be willing to help me with that?
Yes, actually, that would be really a great thing to do. And I'd also, if people are interested in one specific tool and want to do a more in-depth webinar, we could do something like that as well, where people want to look at Kahoot or whatever it might be, we could do a webinar specifically on that tool, or even a kind of like a wrap-up discussion. If we could get the teachers are interested talking to one another, we can make that connection of how are you using this in your classroom.
That would be great. I love all of those ideas. And again, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today and remind all of you that the link to all of these resources should be in a hyperdoc that's linked below the video that we have here. And if you can't find that for some reason, you can email myself or Laura or someone at Region 8 and we'll make sure we get it to you. So thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you, and thanks to Schwab for this grant to help us do this.
Thanks.